So, Andrew Fowler, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk at your conference. I've been sitting in here for about an hour listening to it, and it's very invigorating, I must say, to hear the level of commitment of people talking about how to right at least some of the wrongs of the world. And of course, there are many. Look, the reason I wrote the book and spent so long researching the question of AUKUS was because of the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and the spending of public money without any parliamentary questioning. It was quite absurd for me as a journalist. So, as you can probably see, many years experience, to see that amount of money being spent without question. So I began sort of digging into it to find out actually what had gone on. And what I discovered was, of course, that there was absolutely no parliamentary inquiry. Everything had been covered under national security. That the now head of the national intelligence, Andrew Shearer, had been the major negotiator in Washington for the nuclear submarines to be acquired by Australia, which was quite strange in itself, because to send I feel like a bureaucrat to do that work, it should normally be done by a politician. It was certainly people on the other side he was talking to from the State Department would have probably been surprised by his leading role. I think that it was the level of deception that was involved that surprised me the most, although the arms industry is hardly known for being open. And the level of deception which went right across between Australia and the United States. And who they were deceiving was not just the French, who were shut out completely, but also the Australian people. And the Americans were very closely involved in this deception. They knew that the Labor Party didn't know. They chose not to call the Labor Party, not to ask the Labor Party, who were the opposition. They'd been told that Labor would be okay with this. Apparently, according to newspaper reports, they were told that there'd be no problem, because Labor would go along with whatever they decided. And the French, of course, had been shut out. And you might ask the question, why would the French be shut out of the deal? Why would they not be involved? Why would they not be told that, we actually are going to throw out this contract now, have a new contract, and see whether we should go down the nuclear path or not? And the answer, of course, is that in my book, and the details of it you can read if you choose to do that. You'll read the details of the French being independent, far too independent for the likings of the United States. And so the major reason that we switched from conventionally powered submarines to submarines using highly enriched uranium, dangerous in itself, was because we wanted to be closer to the United States. We didn't want to have France involved in this part of the world. And you can look at the reason why that's so, because France has a more independent defense and foreign policy than the United States. It has a policy that, for example, did not go to war with the coalition, the so-called coalition of the willing in Iraq. And its relationships with China are different. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has said that, for example, the Belt and Road is a Silk Road. He also, when he was in Sydney in 2016, I recollect, he said there should be an agreement between Australia, France, and India, and he didn't actually mention the United States. So you can imagine how well this went down in Washington. Wouldn't have been too keen to see the ally Australia, the sort of, if Britain was airstrip 1 during the Cold War, this would be airstrip 2 during the confrontation with China. Didn't want to see Australia heading off in the direction of being too close to an independent force like France. So the idea was to shut the French out and to form a closer alliance with the United States. And when you look at the alliance at the moment that exists, there's a belief in Australia that if we're attacked, then the United States will come to our aid. It's a complete misunderstanding of the relationship underpinned by ANZUS, the treaty that goes back to the 1950s, is not like NATO. NATO is you attack on one, it's an attack on all. In this case, there's no agreement that if Australia is attacked, the United States would come to Australia's aid. And yet we are host to many of the United States installations, and although they're called joint facilities, they are in fact US controlled in many ways, and certainly US used, particularly Pine Gap, which I'm sure you're all aware of, the activities at Pine Gap, and Northwest Cape, which is used as a submarine communications base, which would be used actually in the event of any kind of conflict to send the launch messages, coded launch messages to US submarines. So you ask a question, what is it about this relationship with AUKUS which makes things so different? And what's happened is that instead of just having interoperability between these two countries' military forces, it's now interchangeability. In other words, it's one and the same thing. We are a completely enmeshed military force. If you look at the question of the submarines and you say, well, aren't they our submarines if we buy them from the United States? The answer to that is absolutely and categorically no, we do not. And the reason that we don't is because we're not capable of operating these nuclear powered submarines. They're far too complicated. We simply don't have the capability. Each one of them, about 130 people on board, require 8 nuclear watchkeepers. These are people who are really trained up to be, if you like, at the level of a physicist. We need 8 of them on each of these boats. That's 24 on the Virginia class submarines. We simply don't have those people at that level. And so you ask the question, well, who's going to staff these? Who's going to staff these nuclear powered boats? And of course, the answer is it'll mainly be the United States. And even if they're not staffing them, they'll certainly be controlling them. And they'll certainly be the ones who will be deciding where they go and what they do. And how do we know that? Because Kurt Campbell, who's Deputy Secretary of State of the United States, has said just about the same thing. He said that it doesn't matter if Australia actually has these nuclear powered boats because they'll do what we want. They're an allied force. So we lose our independence. We lose the power to decide where those boats go. And that's extremely important because submarines aren't just those things that you use to lob weapons into China, which is the way that Scott Morrison and others on the right wing of the Liberal Party have described it. They're actually really important to the defence of Australia in checking the sea channels on the island continent, which are so important for the trading of goods to the rest of the world. They're very important for spying on our neighbours, which is what they do. They're very important to keep everything open around Australia. They're not just these things that are used to attack other countries directly. So the reason that the submarines have become a focal point isn't because they'll be used to chase down Chinese submarines. It's because they're actually used to defend Australia. But of course, what the Americans want and what the Morrison government wanted was just the opposite. They wanted these submarines to actually be used along with the Americans up against the Chinese coast to threaten China. And by using those submarines to do that, it makes Australia far more of a target for China. So instead of making us safer, these submarines actually make us less safe, and they certainly make us less independent. If you look at the way that the French have been behaving, and if you look at the way that Malcolm Turnbull dealt with the French, Turnbull, as an independentist, no matter what you might think of his politics, he was an Australian independentist, and he stood for an independent Australia from the British realm, and he fought for in the Spycatcher trial back in the 1980s to reveal the mendacity of the UK security forces, much to the annoyance of the British and Australian establishment. So Turnbull actually was the person who could see the advantage of having an independent Australia standing apart from the United States, although he's at great pains to point out, as many people often are, that he's not anti-American. But he would have taken us down a path, and we were going down a path to be more independent in our military. And this was the thing that so appalled the United States. This is the thing that forced them to join forces with Scott Morrison, drive the French out, and to embrace us closer to the United States. There is I suppose there is a lesson to be learned from all this, and that is that the arms industry is what can you call it, as opaque as it is, needs to be more transparent. And the Independent Commission Against Corruption, the National Commission, which was mentioned earlier, is a good starting point if you're going to look at actually how things transpired here, because any form of transparency would have allowed the people of Australia to understand what was going on. We weren't only getting closer to the United States, we were abandoning any notion at all of being an anti-nuclear or non-nuclear country. I mean, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because we've got Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, and we've got many other facilities that will be used in any nuclear war. But it was at least a position that didn't fully embrace the nuclear option, which we are now doing. This was a stalking horse, a backdoor entry to turn Australia into a fully nuclearized country, where B-52s in the Northern Territory, there are 6 new hard stands that have been built in Tyndall, will be used to carry nuclear weapons. The B-52H is nuclear capable. And if you've got nuclear weapons, you'll have nuclear storage of nuclear weapons. And Peter Dutton, when he was Defence Minister, negotiating the AUKUS agreement, made an indirect reference to that when he talked of special ordnance being stored here if it was necessary. And special ordnance, in my opinion and the opinion of other people who are knowledgeable in these areas, means nuclear weapons. So we've actually entered a whole new area by buying these submarines from the United States, using highly enriched uranium, and opening our country up to more American presence. So if you're fighting for a more independent Australia, a more independent defence and foreign policy, then it would be a good idea to start looking at the AUKUS Pact and the AUKUS cost of $368 billion, and trying to unpick how we got ourselves into such a pickle. Because even the United States, during those negotiations, actually questioned whether or not Australia could afford $368 billion. And they questioned whether or not there was the political commitment to go all that way. And they were good questions that have not been asked really in this country and not been answered. The question of transparency obviously leads to a question of process and corruption. And where there's opacity and where there's darkness, then, and lots of bags and bags of cash, as you can appreciate, excuse me, it's 6 in the morning where I am. Then you're bound to have people who are interested in getting their hands on that money, of course. Many of the Americans from the American arms industry were advisors to the Australian government during the acquisition process. And one of them in particular, Kirkland Donald, was not only an advisor, he also was the chairman of the company that, if you like, won the contract, although there was no competitive process in this area, to actually build the submarines. He eventually retired from the Defence Department, from being an advisor in the Defence Department in April, I think, 2022. So about 6 months afterwards, citing a perceived conflict of interest. Now, if the person who builds the submarines has been advising the people who were purchasing the submarines for a considerable amount of money, isn't a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. And I would suggest that the Independent Commissioner Against Corruption should actually take a look at that whole AUKUS deal and see just who did benefit financially. We have politicians. Scott Morrison has formed a company with Mike Pompeo, the former the director of the CIA, and they are advising on the best way to deal with the business opportunities that come from AUKUS. There are a number of other people also that have joined the weapons industry. So those are the sort of things I think that could be looked at, and I'm not sure that we will ever get the submarines, by the way, because the Americans can't build enough for themselves. And the British submarines that will apparently get in 2040 are being built by a company that's got a good record for delay and over costs running. So we may not even get those. So to start to unpick things and to end this this fiasco, which is really what AUKUS is, a complete fiasco, or has been described as being a public relations statement, followed by an attempt to colour it in later on at great cost, to wedge Labour, which I'm sure you follow very closely, to wedge Labour on the last election, has, I think, a long way to go, and may not come to fruition. I mean, it's possible that this whole thing could just fall apart at the seams. Now, if you'd like to ask me any questions or how we proceed from here, I'm not sure, but back to you.